The Sacred Garden, a timeless tale. There was once a curious, playful tribe that lived in a sacred garden at the top of a spectacular planet. The lush grounds provided everything the people needed. Without worries, they spent their days playing, creating and dreaming. Life was easy and joyful. One day, one of the inhabitants began to wonder what lay beyond the known edges of their blissful home. She began to dream of exploring the wilderness. When she shared this thought with the others, it quickly progressed from the spark of an idea to a burning group desire. The people began to fantasize about all the wonders they might discover in the wider world. Eventually, the allure of the mysterious unknown overcame their reservations, and the collective decided to embark on a journey. The plan was to split the tribe into two, with one faction heading west and the other east. And when they all had their fill of exploration, they would return to their home and share the fruits of their adventures with the others. After an elated but tearful farewell, each group headed out in their respective directions into the unknown. In their hearts, they could feel their sacred home and the other half of their clan, and they relished the knowledge that one day they would be reunited. And the further they got from the familiarity of their garden, the more strange and foreign everything became. The new and extraordinary environment tantalized and fascinated the two groups as they skipped along with joy-filled hearts. Eventually, they became so entranced by their new surroundings that they rarely thought about their home. And in due course, other than an occasional glimpse at the edge of sleep, they forgot about it. One evening, as the East group sat around a small fire under the expansive starry night sky, they heard a chilling howl. The strange haunting sound prompted a previously unknown feeling to well up from deep within. And this feeling quickly grew gnarly, tangled roots that reached right to the very core of each being. For the first time, it occurred to them that they might not be in harmony with all. Without the loving, unified foundation that their home provided, they were now faced with insecurity. Instead of feeling that they were intimately connected to the world, they felt as though they were forsaken by it. This new awareness caused them to feel an urgent need to protect themselves, and so they began to carry rocks in order to defend their tribe. As they continued on their journey, they found that the weight of the rocks made their progression much more difficult. Because of the burden of the stones they carried for protection, they found they could no longer run and skip with ease. With every step, they began to increasingly feel more weary and more weary. The more stressed and tired they became, the less they were able to connect with the loving feelings of their hearts. And the less they were able to connect the more room there was for the dreaded new feeling fear to fill the space that had once overflowed with wholeness and peace. Before long, the group became obsessed with defending themselves. They created elaborate armor that would not only protect their bodies, but frighten any opponents as well. And they marched forward in military style. Their free time was spent planning defensive strategies or devising more complex weapons. Eventually, a hierarchy emerged as those who were the strongest and most conniving claimed leadership positions and began to use their power to control others beneath them. Finally, one man, the most cunning, violent, scheming, and devious of them all, declared himself emperor and presided over the entire group. Meanwhile, the other group progressed in a slightly different fashion. At first they, like their brothers and sisters, had skipped along with light hearts. But as they journeyed, they began to notice that while there were some parts along the path that were rich with pleasures, delectable fruits, grains, and stones of rare beauty, there were other areas that were desolate and challenging. So when they got to the lush areas, they began to collect the objects that gave them pleasure, so that they could enjoy the riches, even in the harsher times. They also began to adorn their bodies with the treasures they found, and soon came to believe that their treasures reflected their personal worth, and they became obsessed with gathering and hoarding as much as they could. Those that found the most began to focus on protecting what they had. And some started to use a percentage of their reserve to get others to do their bidding. Before long, the group who had left the sacred garden as brothers and sisters became hostile and mistrusting towards each other. People were either covered with so many adornments or lugging so many objects of others that every step became a challenge. Eventually, no longer focused on their original mission, they stopped journeying altogether and began to construct places where they could accumulate their riches. Fortresses were built and armies established to protect them. Their dreams became filled with visions of dread and suspicion, and days were spent trying to manipulate situations to maintain their individual prosperity. The man who had accumulated the most declared himself king and ruled the others with a fist led by greed and pride. So immersed in their own challenges, each group had long forgotten their promise to reunite with the other half of their tribe. Unable to connect to their hearts, their very existence became a tremendous struggle. As they trudged through their days, they cursed the mysterious universe that seemed bent on making their lives miserable. One day, as the group that headed east continued their forward march, they saw in the distance an incredible sight. Ahead of them lay a staggering, complex arrangement of fortresses that were adorned with so many precious jewels that they sparkled like ominous beacons in the morning sun. The emperor called out, "Prepare for battle!" And a haunting screech that expressed both their exhilaration of at last finding their enemy and their readiness to throw themselves into the attack exploded from the company. And when the people within the fortresses heard the cry, they scrambled to the top of their buildings and looked out upon a dreadful sight. A ferocious, demonic-looking army marched like a machine towards the kingdom. The zone exploded into a war that saw too much horror on both sides. With every act of terror perpetrated by one group, the other group felt more righteous and retaliated with an even more violent assault. For eons, the two groups battled. Fear and incredible suffering became the rule for all. Except for the king and the emperor and their immediate circles. While their armies fought, these men enjoyed all the pleasures they could envisage. One day, after much deliberation, a meeting between the emperor and the king was declared. However, because the hate of the others was so deeply ingrained in each person, nobody was hopeful about this historic event. On the day of the meeting, after the heavy doors were closed by their respective guards, the two men walked towards one another. They both nodded and sat down to enjoy the lavish flowing of delicacies that had been provided by their underlings. "Well," said the emperor, "at long last we meet." "Yes," said the king with a sly smile. "I've been admiring your approaches and strategies from my tower. I must say I'm impressed. I have a very high regard for a good opponent." "Yes, I sensed we would likely understand one another, which is why I think you will appreciate what I have to say," the emperor said, leaning in towards the king. "You must be aware that we've both benefited from this war in immeasurable ways," he said quietly. "But these positions we hold and the benefits we acquire from them are very tenuous. Both of us could be overthrown by strong, healthy people who felt they no longer needed us. But right now the people are so fearful that they are desperate to be led. So I suggest that we secretly work together to keep the people in fear and hardship, so that they may continue to be easy to manage, ensuring that we are able to maintain our positions of power and privilege." "Indeed, I very much like the way you think, for I too have come to similar conclusions," said the king, settling in to begin working out the details. When both men emerged from the building, each threw up their hands and declared that peace could never be established with their depraved opponent. And so began a conspiracy that saw war and suffering continue uninterrupted. Over time, beneath the shadow of eternal war, culture continued to develop. The ruling men used their power and wealth to carefully feed and nurture networks, structures, and beliefs that promoted fear and division. And the people came to believe that struggle and hardship were a natural state of being. However, as dark and heavy as life had become, there was always a small spark of hope, truth, and beauty that could not be extinguished. This spark flashed furtively in the eyes of the people in the brief moments when they were able to experience happiness, and stirred a distant yearning for something long forgotten. Most tried unsuccessfully to chase this delectable, fleeting feeling through consumption. More material goods, comfort food, sex without connection. But there were others who searched for something deeper and more meaningful. These people allowed the elusive spark to guide them beneath the surface, where they discovered a more profound reality. Because they did not follow convention, these people were often viewed as outcasts by the rest of the group. But the more they allowed themselves to be guided by this spark, the less they cared, as they sensed a truth that surpassed anything their societies had to offer. They began to recognize the lies and distortions that were fed to them through the channels of power. Some became enraged when they woke up to the ways they were being manipulated. They tried to expose and attack the power structures. And some of these people became so focused on their battles that they were distracted and lost sight of the spark. Their attempts to damage their rulers were unsuccessful, as they were prepared for this type of action, and actually covertly encouraged it, as it continued to promote the us and them way of seeing the world that was the very foundation of their power. When instead the people chose to focus their energy on the spark of love and allowed it to guide them deep within, they discovered the magical space that emitted a frequency of love and unity, and the tyrannical droning of their world became increasingly meaningless to them. The more they learned to connect with this newfound frequency, the more love spread through their personal worlds, and the more they saw signs of the transformation that they craved. At first it occurred in tiny pockets and was largely invisible in the larger society. But slowly and surely it began to grow. When the rulers became aware of the small fire that was beginning to spread among their people, they began to apply more pressure. They colluded to stage dramatic events engineered to increase the levels of fear in the population. And these events acted to justify an increase in control and power. However, those who had connected with the frequency of love could not be swayed by their deceptions. As the frequency of love increased, the tactics that had duped the people for so long became increasingly apparent. With time, all those who were touched by the spreading love found paths that had been worn by the pioneers who'd gone before them, until the path that had once only been a faint suggestion became a flowing thoroughfare heading straight into alignment with love. Eventually, the flow of love became so powerful that no one could resist it, except the king and the emperor, for their hearts had become so cold, so hard, so disconnected, that they had become untouchable. Knowing that the people could see through their lies now, the men feared retribution, and so one night just before dawn, the two rulers ran away and hid together in a cold, dark cave. For many years, the old rulers existed in the darkness, bickering, raging, lamenting the loss of their power. They survived on trickles of condensation, moss, and scuttering insects. Every day they expected would be their last. Every snapping twig or tumbling pebble made them freeze in terror. Eventually their existence became so torturous that they decided to venture out of their hiding spot and face whatever punishment the people deemed appropriate. When they approached the old compounds, they surveyed the incredible changes that had been made. The two zones that had been dirty and neglected due to continuous wars were now joined together to form one stunning community. There were abundant fruits, herbs, and flowers growing in every nook and cranny, between the fascinating creative dwellings that were speckled around in flowing organic formations. They followed the playful sounds along the winding paths to the heart of the community. There they saw the people they had once ruled. Everyone was making music and dancing completely unself-consciously. There was a wildness and a freedom about them that scared the men, and for a moment they considered returning to the cave. But just then, a small child noticed the men and called out to the others. As everyone began to realize that the emperor and the king had finally returned, they formed a throng and ran towards their old oppressors. The two men, stunned by the way this group could move together as one, were too weak to try and run. When the throng reached the men, they swept them up and cheeringly brought them into a large building nearby. Inside, they were gently put down into tubs of warm, sweet-smelling water. Some people from the group began to lovingly wash their tired bodies and clean their many sores. They cried as they saw their wounds and felt the palpable sadness of their hearts. And finally, the emperor collected his senses enough to talk. "What will you do with us?" he asked. "Well," said one of the people, "we have been hoping that you would choose to return. And now that you are home, we will bathe you and nurture you back to health, so that we may all celebrate our reunion." "You know who we are and what we've done?" he asked, confused. Everyone laughed. "Of course we do. You're one of us. Welcome back to the sacred garden, brothers." The mention of the sacred garden and all the gentle love and touch caused something to happen within the hearts of each of the two men. At first they fought it, but soon they realized there was nothing they could do but surrender. The cold, hard shell around their hearts that had allowed them to perpetrate horrific deeds without batting an eye began to melt. And as it did, memories began to flood back. And they remembered the sacred garden, the joyful plans of the group, and they remembered their true, loving selves. As the shame that for so long they'd succeeded in avoiding finally sank in, tears welled up in their eyes, and both men began to wail. Every tear that had been held back flowed now as the men's hearts felt every transgression. And while they cried, the people held them and touched them delicately, gently soothing the pain that exploded from the deep vaults of their hearts. And finally the king whispered, "I am so sorry." Another voice in the crowd spoke up. "We thank you, brothers, for playing the roles that you did. Without you, we would not have grown in the way that we needed to. We had to believe in separation in order to understand it. And now, having fully experienced what it feels like to be unequal, to hate and suffer, we are wiser and stronger. We have grown collectively in profound ways, said another gentle voice. We know the real you. Beneath these roles, it's time to let go of that story. Time to return to self, to heart. We have mourned your loss every day since you disappeared. For without you, we are not complete. Someone else in the group laughed warmly. When we started on our adventure, we thought we were leaving our sacred garden. But we never left. We can't. For we are it, and it is us. We only expanded our horizons, and in order to do so, we needed to confront the unknown. And together we have conquered that fear, and now our sacred garden covers the entire planet. And now that you have returned, we have all finally remembered, and now we can celebrate our unity and prepare for the next level of our incredible journey. The end.